Hi, my name is Denise, and I'm an educator here at History Miami Museum. And today we're going to talk about the Mariel boat lift of 1980. Now, before we start talking about the largest exodus of Cubans within a year span, we need to take a step back to 1959. Dictator Fidel Castro came into power in 1959. His reign would cause waves of Cuban migration to Miami for the rest of the century. In Castro's regime, citizens' ability to own and run your private businesses was made illegal. Political opponents were jailed, and many oppositional newspapers were shut down. This forced many upper and middle-class professionals and skilled craft workers to migrate to the U.S. This first wave was known as the Golden Exile. Then, in 1960 through 1962, the U.S. Department of State and the Catholic Charities of Miami teamed up to bring 14,000 unaccompanied children into Miami. It was the largest recorded child refugee exodus, called Operation Pedro Pan. Through the operation came Willie Chirino and MDC's former president, Eduardo J. Padron. The next wave was the 1965-1973 migration called the Freedom Flights, or Los Vuelos de la Libertad. Flights leaving Cuba for Miami were filled with Cuban hopefuls who had added their name to a wait list with over 1 million people for the opportunity to board that flight. While waiting, these citizens who applied faced harassment. They were fired from their jobs or harassed by neighbors who were on the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, known as CDR. Some citizens were in internment camps, working in fields far from home, awaiting their chance at freedom. The Freedom Flights brought over 250,000 Cubans to Miami within an 8-year period, a relatively slow pace for what Miami experienced in the summer of 1980. The mass exodus of 125,000 people began with just 5 individuals led by Hector Sanustis, who used a public bus to knock down the fence at the Peruvian embassy in Havana, Cuba, on April 1, 1980. Although they had just been bombarded, the Peruvian embassy allowed the 5 asylum seekers to stay. The Castro regime was not happy about this, as it would give other Cubans the unwanted idea of seeking asylum status through the other embassies on the island. Seeing that Peru was not going to turn in the 5 asylum seekers to be imprisoned, a half-mile perimeter was set up around the embassy with Cuban guards. However, this only lasted 4 days because the Castro regime decided to withdraw security forces on April 4th, with the hopes that the citizens who had been turned away would return and overwhelm the facility, forcing Peru to abandon aid. Sure enough, as word spread throughout the western part of the island, people began flooding the embassy. By April 5th, 2,000 people had entered the embassy, which was made up of 2 two-story buildings and a large garden area. This is where most of the asylum seekers slept and lived. It was overcrowded, to say the least. It was not designed to house 10,000 people, which it had by April 6. With overcrowding, hygienic conditions at the embassy were quickly deteriorating. The Peruvian government had to figure out a solution to this overwhelming humanitarian crisis. They began by contacting other countries that would accept refugees. Costa Rica, Spain, Venezuela, and the United States under President Jimmy Carter's administration were some of the countries who agreed to take in refugees. President Carter arranged an immigration registration center in Costa Rica in hopes of controlling the influx of refugees. As these countries sorted out the details of the crisis, unrest started amongst the people in Cuba. Those seeking asylum were labeled as traitors or gusanos, a worm. The protests made it dangerous for those who had passes to go to and from the embassy to their homes. Some even found their home destroyed, and others found their power lines had been cut. With unrest amongst the people growing and countries still figuring out the details of immigration and asylum status, the efforts to organize entry turned out to be in vain. On April 20th, the Castro regime decided to open up the Mariel harbor and announced to the Cuban exiles living in the United States that they were welcome to enter the port and take their family back home with them. Marinas began to empty, people drove down to Key West and began buying or chartering boats and fishing vessels to get their families home as quickly as possible. Cuban guards were set up at the port and instructed to load as many passengers as possible, ignoring the max capacity. They were loading up people who had been at the embassy and worked on retrieving Cubans throughout the island whose family had come for them. These families had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. The Castro regime took the incoming boats as an opportunity to load people from Cuba's prisons. Although not every prisoner was a criminal, some of these prisoners were imprisoned for simply expressing dissent towards the government, attempting to leave the country illegally, or others were imprisoned for being queer or disabled. Also, patients from the psychiatric facility Mazorra were taken out of care and put into boats headed to the U.S. The U.S. Coast Guard was in charge of protecting these refugee vessels, as many of the older boats would experience mechanical failures and end up stranded out at sea. The Coast Guard would be tasked with rescue missions, disembarking overcrowded boats, and of course towing those stranded boats. By April 28th, Monroe and Dade County had received 15,761 refugees, causing then-Governor Bob Graham to declare a state of emergency. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, better known as FEMA, was dispatched to organize the influx of refugees, focusing their efforts on getting refugees off the island of Key West. Temporary housing stations were set up at Trumbull Point in Key West, at the Orange Bowl Stadium, now known as the Marlin Stadium in Little Havana, and under Interstate 95 in downtown, which became known as Tent City. The Miami community came together and donated hygienic supplies, food, and volunteered their time in an effort to prepare the refugees for their next steps. For some who arrived completely undocumented, their journey to freedom in the form of a residential status would be months away. But once released, they would be entering Cuban communities that had been in the making since the 1960s. By October 1980, the U.S. and Cuban government had come to an agreement to end the exodus. As we look back on the Mariel boat lift, those individuals that took a chance and came with little to no items on overcrowded boats for a chance towards freedom will never forget their journey. From refugee status to citizenship, the Mariel refugees went on to enrich Miami's neighborhoods and create homes for themselves here in Miami as well as other parts of the country.
Bill Jorgensen, Jerry Gerard, and the award-winning Action News team.
Good evening. Politicians from several states tonight are sharply criticizing President Carter's handling of the Cuban refugee problem. The governor of Texas, Bill Clements, says the president has literally opened the floodgates, placing no limitations on the number of Cubans entering the United States. Today, the Cuban sea lift slowed a bit, but since last month, 25,000 refugees from Castro's Cuba have come to America. Between midnight and noon today, 23 boats filled with over 800 Cubans reached Key West, Florida. U.S. Marines are now on duty at Key West to keep order among the restless refugees waiting resettlement in the United States. The Coast Guard is urging the Cuban government to adhere to international treaties aimed at protecting lives at sea. Vessels like this one, the Dr. Daniels, were forced to take far more passengers than it has safety equipment for. And getting out of Cuba is still a problem for many. Many of those who have arrived in the States tell horror stories of being beaten by pro-Castro Cubans and secret police. And now reports that the Cuban government has stalled the sea lift operation for at least 12 hours, backing up boats in the refugee-crowded port of Mariel.
And Pat, once the Cubans get to the States, they find that the harassment continues. As we hear now from Christy Whitker, trouble may have already begun at Union City, New Jersey.
The largest group of Cuban refugees to date arrived in New York early this morning after a flight from Miami. The 95 men and one woman were met by volunteers from St. Anthony's Church in Union City and driven to New Jersey, where they spent the night in the basement of St. Anthony's Parish School. This morning, doctors and nurses who'd volunteered their services were examining them, giving inoculations and taking blood samples. But while this was going on in the church, next door in the school, a bomb scare.
That's all they said, was evacuate the school, we're going to throw a bomb in the church.
What kind of accent did the person have?
No, he was an English-speaking person.
How long ago did this call come in? Just now?
Just this minute, when you tried to get into the building, that's why we had to evacuate the school.
While the children waited outside, police thoroughly checked all rooms and closets of the school. The church's doors were locked, and most of the refugees were unaware of the bomb threat. People on the scene told me they feared this could be the beginning of an anti-refugee sentiment in the community. But Father Michael Fuero says from what he's seen in his parish, there's no resentment.
The response on the part of the American people in the parish was a tremendous experience in love and desire to help these unfortunate people.
The coordinators here say they hope to find homes and jobs for 80% of these people by Monday, and then they'll be ready to receive some more. This even though Hudson County currently has an unemployment rate of 8.5% and Union City has a rate of 11.1%. But Father Fuero says the calls just keep coming in.
One company that called us said they had put ads in the paper for over 2 weeks, and nobody ever answered the ad.
What's the job?
I think it was in a factory, sewing.
See, most of the people that we have, they are educated, and a lot of them have trades. 80% of our group have trades.
A new group of refugees is expected early next week, and the North Hudson Council of Mayors has held an emergency meeting and called on the federal government to help. Otherwise, they say, the crisis in Cuba will end up as a crisis in New Jersey.
So it's a big Cuban population still in Union City. You can see the influences of the Cuban community in Union City through the many restaurants throughout the area. Also buildings like the Jose Marti Freshman Academy, the Jose Marti Park, Celia Cruz Plaza, Celia Cruz Way. There's still some cigar shops around. Union City has a Walk of Fame off of Celia Cruz Plaza, which every year they put a star for a different Hispanic star who has performed or has some kind of linkage to Celia Cruz. We have different events every single year to commemorate or celebrate the Cuban heritage. For example, we have a night on May 20th and around May 20th where we celebrate Cuban Independence Day with a culture and patriotic program where we focus on showcasing Cuban music and dance, fine art, poetry, and we all come together and we invite Cuban ex-political prisoners that they have a home here on 43rd and just off of Bergline, where Celia Cruz Way is. And they all come and they all speak about their experiences, and we share the Cuban culture together, where it be Cuban food as well at that event.
Nosotros somos afortunados de tener a la comunidad cubana en Union City. Cuando tú vas por otro sitio, tú dices, vives en Union City, todo el mundo dice, oh, esa es una comunidad cubana.
The Cuban community has contributed so much to the city of Union City, neighborhood towns, and this country as a whole. It's innumerable, the contributions, whether it be in music, in art, in industry, like in the embroidery industry, in cuisine, you name it. It's been in politics. huge amount of contributions.
Cuba Libre, Cuba Libertad, Free Cuba.
Cuba Libre, pa'lante, cubano, lo queremos mucho. A todos los cubanos, mis hermanos, mi familia, que vengan para acá, Union City, Estados Unidos los está esperando y queremos la libertad pronto para ustedes, que sean libres. Dios, con la ayuda de Dios, todos sean libres pronto.
So I'm on 60th Street, Bergen Line Avenue, West New York, New Jersey. And right there behind me is Union City. This is the crossroads of Havana on the Hudson.
Bienvenido a Habana en el Río.
In the 60s, when Cubans started to flee Cuba for freedom and the American way, they came right here to this area, Union City and West New York, New Jersey. This is the biggest population of Cubans outside of Cuba. The main area for the Cuban population is in Union City and West New York. Let's take a ride along Bergen Line Avenue, show love to the Cubans, and check out some great places to eat.
¡Viva Cuba Libre!
De Union City, New Jersey, bienvenidos a Habana en el Hudson. ¡Viva Cuba Libre, patria y vida!
¡Viva Cuba Libre! ¡Abajo el comunismo!
The first Spanish food I ever had was a Cuban sandwich.
For the Cuban people, patria y vida, freedom for Cuba, intervention, that's what we want.
Rumba Cubana, hands down, the best lunch special you'll find at any restaurant. Excellent people, excellent food, one of my favorite Cuban restaurants in the entire area. That place right there.
Cuba Libre.
You're never gonna get a better Cuban sandwich anywhere than right here, La Pola. Fresh ham, fresh pork, cheese, pickles, and the kicker is the fresh garlic. Year after year, consistently voted #1. Best Cuban sandwich you're ever gonna find.
Cuba Libre.
Cuba Libre. Cuba Libre.
And I think that our people has discharged its moral duties. It has discharged its, it has observed its ideals, its principles, and we have been in solidarity.
La compañera Rosamari hablaba.
Comrade Rosemary here spoke about some of the efforts of international solidarity that Cuba has made. She spoke about our doctors. Over 15,000 Cuban doctors have worked as internationalist missionaries in other countries. Millions and tens of millions of people have been taken care of by our doctors. In Africa mainly, in Latin America also, and in other parts of the world.
cientos de miles de
Hundreds
vidas
of thousands of lives
se han salvado
have been
por el
saved
esfuerzo de esos médicos.
by our doctors' work.
Miles y miles
Thousands and
de
thousands
profesores y maestros
of
han
Cuban
enseñado,
teachers and professors
técnicos en
have
todas
trained
las
technicians.
áreas, en todas las ramas.
Also, our technicians in many fields have gone to other countries to
Cuba
work.
que se quedó con 3.000 médicos
Cuba was left with only 3,000
de los
doctors
6.000 que tenía
out of the 6,000 it had in 1959.
y nos llevaron 3.000.
3,000 left.
Mejores salarios, mejores...
They were incited by best salaries here in the United States.
Sin embargo, hoy tenemos
However,
casi 60.000.
nowadays we have 60,000.
Y si un día los norteamericanos
And if one day the
necesitaran
Americans were to need doctors,
médicos, yo sé que tienen mucho,
I can tell you that we can give you.
mucho y muy bueno.
We have many
Pero si en algún
good
lugar, en
doctors.
algún rincón,
We know
en
that you
algún
have
barrio,
them, but if
no
in
hay
any
un médico,
neighborhood you don't have a doctor,
nuestros médicos
our
vendrían
doctors
gustosos a
would
trabajar
come
también
to
en
work
Estados
here.
Unidos. Para citar otro caso de solidaridad,
Just to mention another case in which solidarity was present,
los nicaragüenses necesitaron médicos.
the Nicaraguans needed doctors.
Ustedes saben que en aquella época de otras partes no le mandaron médicos.
You know that at that time, doctors were not sent from other
Enviaron
parts of the world.
cañones, ametralladoras,
Others sent
helicópteros,
cannons,
bombardeadores,
machine guns,
bombarderos,
bombers,
y municiones de
and
todas
ammunitions of all kinds.
Y mientras de otras partes enviaban
So while others
hombres
were sending,
que conducían a la tragedia, a la muerte,
were sending people
2,000
to carry
maestros
tragedy and death,
cubanos,
2,000 Cuban teachers
en su mayoría
went
mujeres,
there, most of them women.
se fueron a enseñar a Nicaragua,
They went to Nicaragua to teach
pero no
the
a
Nicaraguans
Managua,
how to read and write.
no a las ciudades,
But they did not go to Managua, not to
a
the
las
capital.
montañas.
They went to the mountains.
a las selvas,
They went to the places where there were no teachers.
a los lugares más apartados.
They went to the most remote places.
Y cuando pedimos voluntarios para
And
aquella
when we
misión,
asked for teachers to volunteer in Cuba to go to Nicaragua,
se ofrecieron 30,000.
30,000 volunteered.
30,000. Vea, hermano Bock, qué sentimiento de
Look, Brother Butts, what a sentiment of solidarity our people has.
se fue creando.
So that has been growing in our people.
Cuando algunos contrarrevolucionarios
And when some counter-revolutionaries, some gangs in
asesinaron a
Nicaragua,
algunos maestros,
some countries killed some Cuban teachers,
se ofrecieron 100,000.
100,000 Cuban teachers volunteered to take their places.
Esos fueron los valores morales que se fueron creando.
Those have been the moral values that we have
Con
been
los cambios en
creating
nuestro país.
with the changes in our country.
Y voy a citar otro ejemplo.
And I'm going to mention another example.
Cuando hubo un gran terremoto
When there was a
en
big
Perú,
earthquake in Peru,
que mató 100,000
which killed
personas,
100,000 people,
70,000
which killed
personas.
70,000 people,
Pedimos donaciones de sangre.
we asked for blood donations from our people.
Y en 10 días
And in 10 days,
se ofrecieron
We received from our people
100,000 donaciones.
100,000 blood donations to give them to Peru.
Cuando hubo un terremoto en Armenia,
when there was an earthquake in Armenia,
se ofrecieron y se hicieron 50,000 donaciones.
50,000 blood donations were given by our people for them. When there was an earthquake in Iran and thousands of people died, we also collected thousands of donations. And wherever there has been a tragedy, a hurricane, an earthquake, our technicians, our doctors, our people have made their contribution to help, regardless of ideologies, regardless of whether those countries had diplomatic relations with us or not.
En esa conciencia. Ese es el país bloqueado.
That is the country which is under a blockade.
Ese es el país al que se acusa de violaciones de los derechos humanos.
That is the country that has been accused of violations of human rights.
El país que ha elevado el promedio de vida.
The country that has raised
perspectiva de vida casi 76.
Life expectancy to almost 76.
Y que al reducir la mortalidad infantil,
and that has reduced infant mortality rate
de 60 por cada 1,000
from
nacidos,
60 per 1,000 live birth
a menos de
to
10,
less than 10.
Ha salvado la vida. Ha salvado la vida cientos de
And in
miles
doing so, it has saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of children.
de niños. ¿Y a cuántas personas les ha prolongado la vida?
And how many people are living a longer life? How much pain
Ha superado.
has been relieved?
Cuánto dolor físico.
How much physical pain has been relieved?
Del mismo modo que eliminó en los
The
primeros
same
años
way,
el analfabetismo.
illiteracy was eradicated in the first years of the revolution.
Que tiene hoy el más alto per
And today we
cápita.
have the highest per capita,
El más alto per cápita.
the highest number
Profesores y maestros
of
de todos
teachers
los
and
países
professors
del
per
mundo.
capita, and that among all the countries of
Igual
the
que
world.
tiene el más alto per cápita de médicos.
The same way we have the highest
que tiene el más
percentage
alto
of doctors per capita in
de
the
médicos.
world.
Ese es el país acusado.
That is the country which is being accused of
Un país que
violating
desde la
human
guerra
rights.
siguió una línea invariable.
A country that has pursued
Respetar
a
de
steady
manera absoluta
line
y total
of absolute
la integridad
and total
física de las
respect for the physical integrity of its
Y el
citizens.
mejor testimonio fueron los 3,000 prisioneros
And the
que
best
hicimos en
evidence
Guión.
were the 3,000 prisoners we got in the Bay of Pigs.
No hay uno solo
Not only one of them
que haya dicho que fue allí
can
asesinado
say that he was ill-treated.
Alguien haya sido
Not one of them
asesinado
was killed.
al calor de los
Not one of
combates,
them was murdered even after when they were captured after battle.
o a que alguien se le haya tocado un pelo.
Not one of them was hurt.
Volvieron como héroes.
They came back as
Y
heroes.
algunos incluso cambiaron.
And some even changed after that.
Pero nadie pudo decir que
But no
salieron
one could
siquiera
ever
con
say
la culata de un fusil.
that they were hit by one
Ese
of
es
our
nuestro
soldiers.
honor, esa es
That is
nuestra
our
gloria,
honor, that is our
esa es
glory,
nuestra historia,
that is
no
our
importa
history,
las
no matter
calumnias
the
que se han
slanders.
levantado contra
That is the
nosotros.
truth.
He hablado que hemos donado nuestra sangre
I have said that we have given our blood donations
para salvar
to
vidas.
save lives in other
He hablado de
countries.
médicos, de maestros.
We have talked about teachers, about
Pero hemos
doctors,
hecho algo más que
but we have done something more than that.
hemos derramado la sangre
We have
de
shed our
nuestros
blood.
compatriotas
We have shed our
para
blood
para luchar
to
contra el
fight
colonialismo,
against
para
colonialism
defender la independencia
and to
y la
defend the
soberanía del
independence.
pueblo.
makes us feel that we have discharged our duty to humanity.
Fueron los 15 años que luchamos
that is the 15 years
contra
that we fought
Sudáfrica,
against South Africa,
contra el racismo,
against
la
apartheid.
en Angola, los 15 años. años
15 years.
Luchando.
For 15 years we were there fighting apartheid.
Hasta el final.
Fighting racism till the very end.
¿Qué hacían con nosotros? Nos decían que nos bloqueaban.
What were they doing with us? They said that we had to be imposed a blockade.
Porque estábamos cumpliendo esa misión de ayuda allí.
And they were doing that, they said, because we were giving assistance to that country.
Luchando contra los
because we were fighting the South African racists.
Pero una historia muy interesante.
But that is a very interesting story, you know.
Cual un día
something that will one day have to be written.
Uno de los más horribles
one of the most awful systems of discrimination and racism was the one that existed there in that country, in South Africa. Tens of years after the end of fascism and Nazism,
sin embargo,
that situation existed there.
Hoy no se habla mucho.
However, not much is talked today about that, you know.
Nosotros conocemos bien la historia.
We know that history very well. We know it very well.
A Sudáfrica no la bloqueaba.
South Africa was not blockaded.
No le impedían comprar alimentos.
South Africa was not prevented from purchasing food and medicines.
Y al país que luchaba heroicamente.
And the country that was heroically fighting against the racists
no le vendían una medicina,
was not sold one medicine,
una aspirina,
one aspirin,
un cytostatic,
one cytostat. For a cancer patient, that was the punishment.
Hoy todo el mundo es feliz.
Today everybody's happy.
Porque se acabó el apartheid.
Because the apartheid is finished.
Hoy todo el mundo es feliz.
Today everybody's happy.
Porque se produce la independencia de Namibia.
Because the independence of Namibia was attained.
Dura fue la lucha.
But there was a tough struggle.
De namibianos.
By Namibians, Angolans, and Cubans. They had to fight very hard.
Para que ustedes tengan una idea, nuestras tropas
For you to have an idea,
estaban cerca de las fronteras.
Our troops were close to the South African border.
Un país poderoso,
a powerful country, a very wealthy country, South Africa.
Nosotros a más de 10,000 kilómetros.
And we were over 10,000 kilometers away. I mean, Cuba. We were still keeping up that fight 10,000 kilometers away from our territory.
Aquello no era fácil.
Of course, that was not an easy task.
Cada vez que los angolanos iniciaban alguna
Every time the Angolans started an offensive,
intervenían los surafricanos.
The South Africans came over and fought them back. And we said to the Soviets, who were the advisors to the Angolan headquarters, that those offensives were wrong. They couldn't do that. If they were not able to prevent the South Africans from attacking them, it was useless to conduct those offensives.
Eso no se entendía.
But they did not pay attention. They did not understand that. Till there was a moment when a very serious crisis was created. A moment when the war was practically lost. And then we, the Cubans, we had to solve the problem.
Enviamos muchas de nuestras mejores unidades.
We sent many of our best divisions, pilots,
aviones.
planes.
Y le decimos, le vamos a prohibir a los surafricanos
And we said to
intervenir.
them, we are going to prevent the South Africans
Cuando llegó la situación había
from
una gran
acting.
crisis.
When we arrived there was a great
Y es cuando se
crisis.
desarrolla la batalla de Cuito.
It was when the Cuito-Juana Valley battle took place.
¿Sabe cuántos hombres envió Cuba a Angola en ese momento?
You know how many troops Cuba sent to Angola at that moment?
55,000 hombres.
55,000 troops.
55,000 hombres. Lo cual habría y voluntarios todos.
And all of them on voluntary
Lo más
basis.
importante.
That's the most important thing of all.
En Cuito-Juana Valley se estrellaron los racistas.
And in Cuito-Juana Valley, the racists
Ellos
could not
libraron
win.
allá la batalla al este,
They wanted to have the battle to the east,
lugar difícil.
in a difficult place.
Y allí le hicimos la trampa.
But there we lay a trap for them.
Trampa contra la
We
cual
lay a
se
trap
estrellaron,
against which they clashed.
porque se convirtió en un símbolo. y
Because
quisieron
their
tomar.
Cuito-Juana Valley became a symbol.
Enviamos las fuerzas necesarias
We sent the necessary forces
para frenar,
to stop the South Africans' advancement
obligarlas a
and
estrellarse
to
allí.
force them to
Mientras le
defeat.
movimos 40,000 soldados
While we moved
cubanos,
40,000 Cuban troops
20,000 soldados
and
angolanos
20,000 Angolan troops
hacia el suroeste
to the southwest
para amenazar
to
por
threaten them on
en
the
esa
other
dirección
side
al ejército surafricano.
to stop the South African army from trying
Creamos la
something different.
correlación de fuerza
So we were
necesaria,
able to create the necessary balance of power
sencillamente para alcanzar la
simply
victoria.
to stop them and to attain
La
victory.
aplicación de la resolución 435
So
y
the
al final
implementation of Resolution
el cese de la
435 and at the end
como
to put an end to apartheid.
a la heroica lucha,
That
mil
was our
veces
contribution
heroica lucha
to the
del
heroic
pueblo
struggle
surafricano.
of the South African people.
Today, Cuban immigrants and Cuban Americans in Union City on Bergen Line Avenue and in local restaurants saying that they were happy that Fidel Castro is gone. Some said that they're also feeling sad because their parents and grandparents who left the Caribbean island many years ago weren't alive to see this day. They hope and pray for a better future for the island.
People can express themselves freely. That's what they deserve, and that's what Fidel Castro has subjected the people for 57 years, or however long he was in power. It was a subjugation, it was an oppression, but people can express themselves liberally, and I hope that that changes now with what's going on.
His communist revolution outlasted 10 American presidencies and withstood half a century of American economic embargo. He survived numerous attempts to overthrow or assassinate him. He fought off one U.S.-backed invasion at a little-known beach called Playa Girón in what Americans came to know as the Bay of Pigs, and helped unleash a superpower confrontation by installing Soviet missiles in Cuba. The world has seen little of the Cuban leader in the past decade after serious intestinal illness struck in 2006. In 2008, he stepped down as president, putting his brother, Army head Raúl Castro, at the country's helm. This feeble old man in a tracksuit was a pale shadow of the overconfident 32-year-old guerrilla who shook up the Western Hemisphere. Fidel Castro triumphantly took control of Cuba on January 1, 1959. He rolled into Havana atop a tank a week later. He came down from his guerrilla stronghold in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, joined by his partner in revolution, the Argentine Che Guevara, and a small rebel army. They had toppled the right-wing dictator Fulgencio Batista, who had been in and out of power in Cuba for 25 years. Castro quickly nationalized U.S.-owned companies and property in Cuba, along with church holdings and the farms and businesses of wealthy and middle-class Cubans. The U.S. responded with an economic boycott that lasted decades, and Castro began an alliance with America's superpower rival, the Soviet Union.
¡Viva la amistad entre los pueblos soviéticos y el pueblo cubano!
Departing President Dwight Eisenhower severed all links with Cuba.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached. Our friendship for the Cuban people is not affected.
The hardships placed upon the Cuban economy and Castro's repression of his Cuban opposition sparked a series of mass migrations that would profoundly affect the United States and the future of U.S.-Cuba relations. The new American president, John Kennedy, picked up one of his predecessor's plans, an armed overthrow of Castro. The CIA trained an army of 1,200 Cuban exiles to invade and begin a popular uprising. On April 17, 1961, the small counter-revolutionary force stormed the beach on Cuba's southeast coast. Many Cuban people rallied to Castro, and his forces quickly put down the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a disaster for the new Kennedy administration, but the following year brought a new confrontation and even more danger. On October 16, 1962, U.S. spy planes photographed the construction of a Soviet missile site in Cuba. A crisis ensued which brought the world the closest it had ever come to nuclear annihilation. A U.S. naval blockade called a quarantine was forced on Cuba. Kennedy took to the airwaves and warned of the consequences.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
It took 12 days of intense negotiations and UN diplomatic efforts, but the Soviets backed down and promised to remove the missiles from Cuba in return for a U.S. commitment not to invade the Caribbean island. The NewsHour's Robert McNeil, who was in Havana at the time, asked Fidel Castro about the missile crisis in a 1985 NewsHour interview.
When the crisis was at its very height, did you personally think did you believe that nuclear war was a possibility on one of those days? Did you believe, as you sat here in Havana, you believed it?
Yes. Yes, I believe that as a possibility.
What did you feel about your role in having brought it to that point?
It was not me. It was the United States. The one that led us to that point. It was the United States that initiated the blockade, that organized the invasion, the sabotage, the pirate attacks, the mercenary invasion, and those that spoke of an invasion against Cuba. It was the United States, it was not us. And I believe that we answered correctly. I have no doubt whatsoever. What were we to do? Yield? Or the United States could feel sure that we will never yield. Under conditions such as those, we will fight.
Castro put down dissent. Economic conditions worsened. Emigration to the United States surged. Exiles and their families filled American cities and prospered in places like Miami's Little Havana. These immigrants became a force in American politics, standing against any efforts to lift the embargo or reopen diplomatic relations. All the while, Castro endured. He rallied his faithful supporters in the capital with his trademark hours-long fiery speeches full of nationalist and socialist rhetoric. Crowds of thousands turned out to listen. Even with massive Soviet subsidies, another dramatic economic downturn hit Cuba in 1980, and Castro said anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could do so by boat. Again, a huge wave of immigrants headed to the United States in what became known as the Mariel boat lift. Many of these were prisoners and convicts, but Castro continued to hold a tight grip on his people through restrictions on free speech and free press. He quieted the opposition with imprisonment, and he did not deny that his jail held political prisoners when the NewsHour's Robert McNeil asked him in 1985.
Yes, we have them. We have a few hundreds political prisoners. Is that a violation of human rights? Those that have infiltrated through our coasts, those that have been trained by the CIA to kill, to place bombs. Do we have the right to put them to trial or not? Are they political prisoners? They're something more than political prisoners. They're traitors to the homeland.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, subsidized sugar prices and cheap oil from Cuba's communist ally disappeared. Cubans were again asked to tighten their belts. Castro needed new friends. In 1998, the communist leader came face-to-face with communism's arch-rival. Castro welcomed Pope John Paul II to Cuba. The Pope addressed the Cuban people at a mass where thousands turned out. He called for an end to human rights abuses and drew the world's attention to the plight of the Cuban people. Castro did come to loosen some restrictions on the Catholics in Cuba. The Pope's message did little else to change the day-to-day lives of Cubans. But in later years, Castro found new allies in the hemisphere.
¡Viva la República Bolivariana de Venezuela! ¡Viva Cuba!
In leftist leaders like Venezuela's Hugo Chavez and Bolivia's Evo Morales, who said they were inspired by the Cuban Revolution and joined Castro in delighted defiance of Uncle Sam. Fidel's slow fade began on July 31, 2006, when he ceded power to his younger brother Raul. The news that Castro had undergone successful surgery for gastrointestinal bleeding aired over state television. In the States, among the exile and Cuban American population, there was anxiety, along with jubilation at the idea that this could be the end. But soon, Castro allowed himself to appear in photos from his hospital bed and even entertain friends while convalescing. When he was up and moving in October of 2006, the video captured a frail and aging man in a much weakened state, trying to look healthy. In December 2006, Cubans celebrated the 50th anniversary of the revolution and a belated birthday without the guest of honor who was still too ill to attend. He didn't reappear in the public eye until 2010, and almost a year later he officially resigned as the Communist Party's leader. In 2012, Cuba hosted another pontiff, Pope Benedict. Castro was too ill to attend a large mass which drew thousands, but the pair did hold a meeting.
These 50 years have shown that isolation has not worked. It's time for a new approach.
Then, in December of 2014, President Obama announced the United States would reestablish diplomatic ties with Cuba. That meant opening up an embassy in Havana, expanding economic ties, and easing travel bans. The first step was a prisoner swap between the two countries. But the deal was made with Fidel's brother, President Raul Castro. It was the first major discussion between presidents of the U.S. and Cuba since 1961, and Fidel was still nowhere to be seen. Despite his decline from public life and politics, the communist icon continued to publish editorial columns and assume the role of an elder statesman.
When my grandmother arrived here from Cuba, after 10 years of being separated from my mother, she brought one thing with her: this statue of La Caridad del Cobre, Our Lady of Charity, the patron saint of Cuba. The statue held a place of prominence in her living room, surrounded by candles, rosaries, prayer cards, and a collection of smaller statues of saints that seemed even smaller around her. When my grandmother passed away, that statue moved to my parents' home, where she had a similar place of prominence. And then, when my mother died, she moved to my home. As a child, I would look at the statue with curiosity and wonder, why is it so important? Why is it the only thing my grandmother brought from Cuba? In many ways, I became a scholar of religion to answer the questions: who is La Caridad del Cobre, and what is her significance for the Cuban people? As the daughter of 2 Cuban exiles and a scholar, I have come to learn that there are many versions of La Caridad. She has been reinterpreted and transformed by the Cuban people. And I've also discovered that in telling the story of La Caridad, we learn something about the power of religious symbols as a whole. I first learned about La Caridad through my Cuban Catholicism. I was told the story of 3 men in a boat, one black, one white, one biracial, who in the midst of a storm began praying, and behold, Mary, the mother of Jesus, appears before them. In Cuban mythology, these men are known as Los Tres Juanes. They represent the 3 cultures and races that constitute Cuba: African, Spanish, and mulatto. Prayer cards tell this story, showing an image of Mary looming over 3 men in a boat as waves crash over. This is the most familiar image to many of La Caridad, as powerful. And in a community where thousands have risked their lives in homemade rafts to flee the island, this image resonates with Cubans and Cuban Americans. She accompanies those who face turbulent waters in search of freedom and family. Interestingly, though, this has little to do with the actual historical account of La Caridad. I discovered the historic Caridad as a PhD student sitting in the archives in the University of California at Berkeley. I was shocked to discover a first-hand account by a slave named Juan Moreno, who claimed to be one of the 3 men that discovered the statue. As he recounted it, Moreno, along with 2 indigenous brothers, Juan and Rodrigo de Hoyos, were in the Bay of Nipe when they saw a statue of Mary floating in the waters. They gathered her and took her to the town of Cobre, a community of royal slaves. A shrine was built for her by the slave barracks, and soon miracles are attributed to her. Healings occur, and she begins to mysteriously disappear and reappear throughout the night. When Spanish authorities decide to move her to a more prominent place away from the slave barracks, she protests, reappearing at her original shrine by the slaves. In this version, La Caridad takes the side of the oppressed, choosing the African slave over the Spanish. La Caridad remains a local devotion until the late 19th century, cared for by the slaves and ex-slaves in Cobre. But then, during Cuba's wars of independence, soldiers begin petitioning to her. They pin images of her on their uniforms, and the altar on her shrine becomes covered with medals, uniforms, and crutches attesting to healings. By the time Cuba gains its independence, she has become the national virgin, La Virgen Mambisa, the fierce virgin. In 1916, she is named patroness of the island, and a new shrine, is constructed in her honor. And many forget her roots in Cobre, among the slaves and ex-slaves that cared for her. But La Caridad del Cobre's relationship with Afro-Cuban devotions does not end here. Afro-Cuban religions arrived in the 16th century when the first slaves came to the island. These religions were able to thrive, albeit secretly. Slaves would take their African beliefs and practices and mask them with Catholic rituals, prayers, and images. We see this in La Regla de Ocha, popularly known as Santeria. At the center of Santeria are the Orishas, superhuman beings that mediate our relationship with the sacred. In Santeria, we have a core of Yoruban religion with a mask or layer of Catholicism upon it, the way in which slaves were able to cover their religious beliefs and practices. And so every Orisha has a Catholic counterpart. La Caridad del Cobre is associated with the Orisha Oshun. Oshun is a powerful female Orisha, the source of life. She's associated with rivers and fertility. Her favorite color is yellow, the color of the dress worn by La Caridad. And it is no coincidence that Oshun's favorite flowers are sunflowers, and these are the flowers that are brought by Catholics as offerings to La Caridad. The entire Orisha pantheon has a specific Orisha that is associated with a particular saint or image of Mary. So, for example, when slaves appeared to be venerating St. Lazarus, they were in fact making offerings to Babalu Aye. The 1959 Cuban Revolution begins the experience of exile for thousands of Cubans and their children. And they, like my grandmother, brought La Caridad with them. On September 8th, 1961, her feast day, a statue of La Caridad, a duplicate of the original, is brought from Havana to Miami. 25,000 Cubans are there to greet her, and a mass is said in her honor. And so begins her relationship with the diaspora, her life as Our Lady of Exile. As the story goes, the statue was smuggled off the island in a suitcase with the help of the Panamanian embassy. 5 years later, the Archdiocese builds a shrine for her here in Miami. The shrine is an epicenter of the Cuban community, where the negotiation of nationalism, identity, and religion are at the forefront. It is also a contested religious space, where practitioners of Santeria will make offerings to Oshun and the other Orishas, much to the disdain of the Catholic clergy. And so now we have two duplicate images of La Caridad, one in Miami and one on the island, mirroring the divide between the exile and the island communities.
The world is watching, right? I begged them!
Thanksgiving Day 1999, two fishermen pull a barely conscious boy from the waters off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. The boy is found alone, clinging to an inner tube. Elian, his mother, and 12 others had fled Cuba 3 days before, but when their boat sank, only Elian and 2 others survived. The next day, November 26, INS grants his Miami relatives temporary custody. The Gonzalez family takes the boy to their Little Havana home. But on November 27th, from Cuba, Elian's father, Juan Miguel Gonzalez, demands his son be returned to the island. The battle for the 5-year-old boy ignites.
Definitely the station was at its best during the Elian Gonzalez saga. I covered that one closely, and for me, it was personal. As a Cuban American, Elian Gonzalez, I knew the struggles that he and his family had gone through to get him here to this country, but then his father wanted him back.
January 5th, the INS recognizes Juan Miguel Gonzalez as Elian's legal guardian and says the boy should be quickly reunited with his father. Angry Cuban Americans paralyze traffic in Miami in protest over the decision. Dozens are arrested.
The Elian Gonzalez story was one that almost ripped the newsroom apart. We were all on heightened alert, and I remember breaking up several almost fistfights in the newsroom between employees who had difference of opinion about what should happen and when. It was an incredibly stressful time. It was a story where people cried, and as a manager and a leader of the team at that time, it was not to say you cannot have emotion around this, but it was to know that emotion, but also to make sure that our coverage was separate from the emotion. And that was a very hard thing to do.
So I was conflicted about the whole situation, and covering it, it was very difficult to try to be neutral, as I always try to be, no matter how I feel on the situation. So for me, I thought that we really did a service in this community when we covered that story.
Good afternoon, everyone. Events are changing moment by moment in the case of Elian Gonzalez.
And officials right now are trying to get his Miami relatives to voluntarily hand over the child to his father.
I'm just praying for this child. You know, that I pray that, you know, he could stay in this wonderful country of ours.
I'm here to support Elian. Everybody that's here tonight is really just giving it one last shot, and you know, we're just really hoping.
I don't want to be selfish. I don't
I don't want him for me. I want what's best for him and what he wants. We've always, as a family, want him to be with his father and with his grandparents, but here, where his mom lost her life to bring him to. And I feel that this little kid really knows what happened in that ocean, and he's always asked us that he wants to stay here. Besides that, once I told him, wouldn't you like to be with your father and wouldn't you like to go there? And he looked at me and he said, my mom brought me here.
La posición que estamos llevando a cabo es difícil.
Janet Reno was the Attorney General, and she ordered the Elian to go back to Cuba with the father. They stormed the house.
Here comes the raid right now.
April 22nd, 2000, 5:14 a.m. Federal agents raid the Little Havana home of the Gonzalez family. Elian is seized.
Against the barrier now!
The whole world is watching this! You're traumatizing my boy!
Get back up against the barrier now! You, go! Get out now!
You guys watching, right? Let me go to the other side.
No, let's go! That way, barricade, get over!
Watch out.
Someone comes running to the back house, running that the marshals were here. I personally didn't believe it. I got up, and when I looked and I saw them coming, I locked the door. They got the boy inside the room with Angela and Donato. Then I was trying to help, actually. I wanted to get the camera guy to be able to catch this scene because, I mean, I could conceive that they were coming in the house with gun, shotgun, with a flashlight, telling everybody to stand down. The cameraman got knocked down to the floor, put a gun at his head. I grabbed Mary Lacey's, and Mary Lacey's screaming, don't do it, we'll hand the child over, don't do it.
I begged them, please don't turn in the boy, don't do this. I begged them.
They break the door down of her bedroom. She's screaming not to do it while she has a gun at her chest. Alan told me, the photographer, grabbed the boy with a gun, pointing at Elian crying. We saw Elian being dragged out by the federal agent.
The standoff between the Miami relatives and the U.S. government is over in just a matter of minutes.
Earlier this morning, federal agents in Miami began to reunite Elian Gonzalez with his father and uphold the rule of law. As I speak, Elian is safe, and he is on a plane headed for Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C., where he will be reunited with his father for the first time in 5 months. Juan Miguel Gonzalez wants to be with his son, and that will happen now. Law enforcement personnel were on the scene, were authorized to, and did make the final call as to when to enter the Gonzalez home, because this was a very carefully timed law enforcement operation. 8 agents were in the house during the operation. They were there for 3 minutes. During that time, a female agent picked up Elian and spoke to him in Spanish.
And before they did that, I stood in front of I don't know how many guns, and I opened my arms to them, and I cried and I begged, we're not gonna do anything, we'll give you the boy, don't let this happen like this. And they just broke everything. They treat us like criminals.
There were riots in Miami when Elian was taken away.
Tony, this is the last thing I can assure you that the Cuban-American leadership in this community wanted to see. The street's literally burning now. Another tire fire had been set right in the middle of 27th Avenue. Tear gas, John. Come back to us, Chaz, right now. Chaz, right now. They look like soldiers. They're firing tear gas to clear out the area.
And on that day, near Flagler and 27th, John Lang and I were tear gassed 4 times in one day.
Oh, we're getting tear gassed again. Just as you said that, some tear gas was...
So the police were trying to disperse crowds that were burning cars and burning tires, and we were right there trying to report on all this without getting hurt. The sensation of being tear gassed 4 times in one day, including a couple of times while we were on live television, and like, you know, all of your sinuses are draining and you're just in agony and you're on live television. That actually happened to us, and that's something I won't forget about the Elian Gonzalez saga.
Obviously doing political maneuvers to please the Cuban government.
This has been a very emotional case for everyone involved. The most important thing is that Elian is safe and that no one was seriously hurt. As we all await the outcome of the appellate process, I think it is important for us all to accept Elian's long overdue reunion with his father. It is time to heal wounds that have divided the community. It is time to help this little boy heal from the tragedies that he has experienced.
Tonight, Judicial Watch now joins in the Miami relatives' fight to keep Elian in the United States. More protests in Little Havana as time now runs out on Elian Gonzalez's stay in the United States. A last-ditch appeal to the United States Supreme Court on Monday.
With legal avenues exhausted and several courts siding with the Justice Department and Juan Miguel, 6-year-old Elian Gonzalez boards a plane headed for Cuba, 7 months after his saga began.
If we had to do it all over again, we would. Elian's mother wanted him to live in the United States, in freedom.
I did it for one reason. I thought the little boy belonged with his father.
Our city is a museum, and sometimes we understand why people see a lot of value in the decaying architecture, because it's beautiful. Sometimes you see an eroded wall or with lack of paint or a crumbling building, and there is beauty in the ruins. But to us, to architects and urban designers, it's a little bit painful because there are ruins that will disappear. There are certain regulations that are allowing like common ordinary Cubans to open little businesses, either opening a restaurant or a cafe or renting rooms or whatever. That improves their economy. And in some places you see how buildings are restored and they're amazing. So little by little we are achieving that. I believe that we should have an opening, a regulatory opening that allows other people to come and invest in public partnerships, in family businesses. That could help individual families improve, and together with that, buildings will improve by more investment coming to the country, by sharing businesses with other people, with Cubans from here and from the outside. Half my generation, it's in other countries, in the United States or in Spain. I think some of them have already created their families, but they still feel connected with this country. And probably they will not come for good, but they will share vacations or businesses with people they know here, with friends. Why not?